It's me.
Statistical Society of Canada. We have Professor Tanney, an associate professor at York University, and we have Mr. Doucette, who is the English editor of Québécois Libre. Welcome to all of you, and we'll begin without further ado with questions and comments from members of the committee, beginning with Mr. Rota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for coming today on a beautiful summer day to give it up to be here. Obviously, this is a very important issue. I'd like to start with Mr. McLeish on a question regarding the Statistical Society of Canada. And from what I understand, you have members who work in various areas of statistics gathering and reports. How do you determine who exactly are the members of your society? Maybe we'll start off with that, if you can give us just a brief overview. And I realize we don't want to take up too much time, so this way we'll establish where you're coming from.
We have about 1,000 and some members, including a large number of academic statisticians from universities across the country, students, practicing statisticians, a number from Statistics Canada, of course, and provincial statistical agencies, and then statisticians that work in biostatistics and work for private firms.
Very good. So, I mean, you've got a lot of credibility, a lot of people there. This seems to have just shown up out of nowhere. Were any of your members, or were you as a society, consulted before any announcements were made?
No, we were not consulted, but then I would have been a bit surprised if we were. I think what we might have expected is that statisticians in one or other of the various related agencies would be fairly thoroughly consulted on this issue.
Are you aware of any of your members who were thoroughly consulted?
No.
No. So it's out there, and the long form census is something that we've heard a lot of information on, over the last little while, but especially today. What do you believe would be the effect of making this a voluntary item, as opposed to enforcing that they actually fill it out?
Well, in general, the presence of bias in voluntary surveys is well known and well documented, and I think any statistics society anywhere would support that, including the American Statistical Association, the Royal Statistical Society. The real question is how much bias is present in each of the responses. And it can be quite pernicious in some cases. It can be less severe in others. So the correct answer to the question is it's a complete unknown.
So there's no way of knowing what we'll end up with down the road? Not
without a carefully conducted pilot, which could be done, provided that the 2011 census went ahead in its standard traditional form, in its mandatory form. A pilot could be conducted which would at least try and investigate the degree of bias associated with the voluntary survey. But we know bias will be present.
So a plan should have been thought out then. What you're saying is a plan should have been well thought out, thinking out what the implementation would be for voluntary. And would you have a parallel? Is that the way you would run them? The voluntary and the mandatory going through similar tracks so that you can compare the outcome of the two?
Well, I'm not referring to what should have been done.
What would you normally do?
You have a copy, I think, of a statement that we made, and we're suggesting, among other things, that the mandatory long form be reinstated for 2011, that Statistics Canada, with the advice of the National Statistics Council, be directed to undertake studies to show the impact of a voluntary survey over a mandatory one. And that's essentially what I'm saying. I'm looking forward, not back.
Very good. Now, a lot of the decisions that are made, whether it's business, science, social programs, rely on the reliability or the accuracy of the long-form census. Let's say for someone who's making decisions, whether it's policy, provinces making policy, municipalities, employers, there's a bias there. How does this affect them, or is it an unknown? What exactly would it mean to someone who's trying to come up with a decision? They're given information, that really doesn't reflect what's happened in the past, where do they go with this? What do they do? Or do they just throw it aside? And
that's entirely up to them. But clearly, if there's an undercount in a certain ethnic or social group or economic group, and we don't know the degree of that undercount, then there isn't a great deal they can do except perhaps run their own attempt at estimating these quantities.
And that's where I'm going with this, or trying to figure out. We have groups that are represented as it is now, and by making it mandatory, everyone has to answer the questionnaire. So everybody's represented. What groups will be more represented? What groups will be less represented on something like this?
Well, that's part of the difficulty, that we really don't know. It's a combination of factors, obviously. I have a daughter with 3 children under the age of 2, all in diapers. There are days when she can't brush her teeth. She has a neighbor with 1 daughter who's 9 years old. Which of those 2, given a voluntary survey, is more likely to be inclined to fill it out? I think there is going to be a clear bias in favor of people who have time, who are motivated, who see some benefit to the data coming from this, who are perhaps civic-minded and law-abiding citizens. Unfortunately, governments at all levels make policy decisions, not just for the law-abiding citizens who drive under the speed limit and don't litter, but for all of society, including those who exceed the speed limit.
Would it be fair to say that those who need it most will be underrepresented, or likely underrepresented?
I don't want to speculate too much on who's undercounted. We do know that, of course, people with language difficulties, the poor will probably be undercounted, but the only way of knowing for sure is to do a properly designed study comparing the two.
So, from what I'm getting then, or from what I'm understanding, it wouldn't be unfair to say, or it wouldn't be unfair to assume that the decision to get rid of the long forms census was rather rash and not well thought out, and doesn't lead to good policy making in Canada.
No, I'm not going to say that. What I'm going to say on behalf of statisticians in Canada and the U.S. and the United Kingdom and Australia and New Zealand and every other place where a census is essentially mandatory is that I would like the government to go forward with a compromise position that the National Statistics Council has outlined, and it's very much in parallel to what the Statistical Society has provided you with today. And that provides for reinstatement of the 2011 census and simultaneously a study of the impact of a voluntary survey for any bias which might, and I think very likely will, creep into the responses on certain questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McLeish. Thank you, Mr. Rota. Monsieur Bouchard.
Oui. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to all 4 of you witnesses for being with us here this afternoon. My first question goes to Mr. Simard.